The call for help. The peaceful planet of Veldin had always been a thriving place. Its green hills, vast oceans, and peaceful cities were a testament to the advanced civilization that called it home. But all of that changed one fateful day. A strange, dark fleet appeared in the skies, sending shockwaves through the planet's defenses. These invaders were like nothing Veldin had ever faced before. They moved with brutal precision, and their weapons tore through the planet's once impenetrable shields. The Veldin Council, composed of the planet's brightest leaders, watched in horror as their world crumbled. The enemy's attacks were relentless, leaving no corner of the planet untouched. Cities were reduced to ruins, and the once proud military of Veldin was quickly overwhelmed. The invaders had one goal in mind: complete and utter destruction. In their desperation, the Veldin Council made a decision that would change everything. They sent out a distress signal, a last-ditch cry for help. This wasn't just any message. It was a call to the galaxy's most feared warriors, a force so deadly that even the invaders would hesitate to cross them. The Veldin leaders knew that their only chance for survival rested with the Deathworlders. The Deathworlders were a myth to most, legends whispered in fear by those who had heard of their terrifying power. Humanity, born on a planet known as Earth, had a reputation for being one of the toughest species in the galaxy. Their military, the Deathworlder fleet, was famous for its brutal efficiency and for the savagery of its soldiers. No one knew exactly where the Deathworlders came from, but their reputation was enough to instill fear in the hearts of even the strongest enemies. As the distress signal reached the Deathworlders, it was received with a cold, calculating professionalism. For the Deathworlders, this wasn't about mercy. It was about survival and the thrill of battle. They had no interest in the politics of other species. To them, the call for help was simply an invitation to prove their strength. Back on Veldin, the alien leaders anxiously awaited a response. They knew that the Deathworlders were powerful, but they also knew they were merciless. Would they come to their aid, or would they see this as an opportunity to take advantage of a weakened planet? Fear gripped the hearts of the council members as they debated the decision. Some argued that it was better to go down fighting alone than to trust such a dangerous force. Others insisted that it was their only hope. With every passing moment, the enemy grew stronger. There was no more time for debate. The decision was made. The Deathworlders would be the planet's last hope. The Council sent another message, urging the fleet to come as quickly as possible. The Veldins could only wait now, unsure of what would happen next. In the distance, high above the ruined cities of Veldin, the sky began to darken. It wasn't the same dark sky as before, though. This was something different, something worse. The shape of the Deathworlder fleet appeared in the heavens, vast and menacing, blotting out the stars as it descended toward the planet. The Veldin citizens looked up, their hearts sinking in dread. They didn't know if they would be saved or if they were witnessing the beginning of their extinction. The Deathworlders' ships were enormous, each one a symbol of raw power and destruction. They cut through the atmosphere like knives, and their weapons hummed with lethal intent. The first wave of Deathworlder ships landed on Veldin's surface, and with them, an eerie silence fell over the planet. The aliens had no idea what to expect. Had they made the right choice? Would these deadly warriors save them, or was this just another step toward their destruction? As the Veldin leaders gathered in their command center, their screens flickered to life with the image of a Deathworlder fleet captain. The image was sharp, clear, and cold. His expression was unreadable, his voice stern. "We've arrived. Now, tell us what you need." The Veldin leaders exchanged glances, their nerves raw with fear. The first wave of invaders had been wiped out by the Deathworlders, but there was no time to relax. The rest of the enemy forces were still out there, and the planet's defenses were nearly gone. "Thank you for your help," one of the Veldin leaders said cautiously, "but what price do you expect for this aid?" The Deathworlder captain's voice was low, almost bored. "We ask for nothing. For now." The words hit the Velden leaders like a cold slap. For now. What did that mean? Were the Deathworlders truly here to save them, or did they have something more sinister in mind? The unanswered question lingered in the air as the tension rose. The clock was ticking. With every passing moment, the alien invaders regrouped, preparing for their next assault. The Velden leaders had little choice but to trust the Deathworlders for the time being. But in the back of their minds, a new fear was taking root. What would happen after the battle was won? What would the Deathworlders want in return? As the final preparations for the battle began, the Veldens braced themselves for the storm that was coming. They knew one thing for sure. Their survival depended on the Deathworlders, but the cost of that survival was still unknown. The true nature of the Deathworlders remained shrouded in mystery, and as the battle loomed closer, the tension between the two forces only grew. In the end, only one question remained. Would the Deathworlders save the Veldens, or would they be their undoing? The fate of the planet and its people hung in the balance. The Deathworlders respond. The sky above Velden was darker now, and the air was thick with anticipation. The people of the planet had watched in awe as the enormous Deathworlder fleet descended, their ships cutting through the atmosphere like a storm of steel. There was no turning back now. The fate of Velden rested entirely in the hands of these mysterious, feared warriors. As the first waves of Deathworlder soldiers disembarked from their ships, their imposing figures towered over the Velden population. Clad in armor, their faces hidden behind helmets, they exuded a terrifying confidence. The Deathworlders' reputation for brutality and efficiency was known across the galaxy, and now Velden was about to witness it firsthand. In the midst of the chaos, the alien leaders gathered in their war room, anxiously watching the scenes unfold on their screens. The Velden Council had made the decision to trust the Deathworlders, but the doubts still lingered. Would these warriors truly save them, or was this simply the first step in a more dangerous game? "Ready the forces," the leader of the Velden Council said, his voice strained with fear and hope. "The Deathworlders are here, but we must ensure they have everything they need. We don't know what price they'll ask for their help." His words were met with nods, though many of the council members still looked uneasy. They had seen the invaders' power, but the Deathworlders were another level entirely. Could they trust them, or would they be taken advantage of in the end? In the distance, the ground trembled as the Deathworlder forces began their march. The alien invaders, who had already devastated Velden's defenses, were now preparing for their next strike. But they were not expecting what was coming. They had thought they had the upper hand. But the Deathworlders' arrival sent a shockwave through their ranks. The first wave of Deathworlder soldiers clashed with the invaders near the ruins of a major city. The aliens watched in awe and fear as the Deathworlders unleashed their fury. They moved like a well-oiled machine, their weapons slicing through the enemy with terrifying precision. It wasn't long before the invaders began to retreat, clearly unprepared for the ferocity of the Deathworlders' assault. "Is this the help we've been waiting for?" one of the Velden leaders asked, disbelief in his voice. The scene on the screen was one of utter chaos, but the Deathworlders were pushing forward, clearing the way for the alien forces to regroup. "They are strong," another leader observed. "But what is their endgame? What do they want from us?" The captain of the Deathworlder fleet, a towering figure with a deep voice, appeared on the council's communication screen. His presence was commanding, and the coldness in his eyes was unmistakable. "We've cleared the city of invaders. What are your next orders?" he asked, his tone businesslike, almost indifferent to the destruction surrounding him. The Velden leaders exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected the Deathworlders to fight, but they hadn't anticipated how decisively and ruthlessly they would act. The Deathworlders' force was overwhelming, yet there was still an underlying fear in the council members' hearts. One leader, a woman named Elira, finally spoke up. "You've helped us, but we have no idea what the cost will be. We must know what you want in return." The Deathworlder captain's expression didn't change. His answer was simple and chilling. "For now, Nothing. Focus on the war. Afterward, we will discuss the price. That sent a cold shiver down the spine of every leader in the room. They had saved their planet from certain destruction, but this deal was far from straightforward. For now, the Deathworlders were content with helping, but what would they want when the battle was over? And would the Veldans be able to pay that price? On the battlefield, the Deathworlders showed no mercy. The invaders were no match for the relentless assault. Each movement of the Deathworlders was precise and brutal. Their soldiers were experts in combat, using strategies that the invaders couldn't anticipate. The Deathworlders' ships hovered above, unleashing firepower that turned the invaders' weapons to dust. The aliens could only watch in stunned silence as the battle raged on. The Deathworlders fought with a fury that was terrifying to behold, and with each passing minute, the invaders' forces shrank. It became clear that the Veldans had made the right choice by calling for their help, but the question remained: at what cost? Hours passed as the battle continued. The Deathworlders' soldiers systematically eliminated every last trace of the enemy, ensuring that there would be no more threats to Veldan's survival. When the final shot was fired, the Veldans' planet was safe. For now, the survivors among the invaders were captured, and the remaining enemies were driven off. The Deathworlders had delivered on their promise, but now the Council had to face the real challenge. What did the Deathworlders want in return for their aid? As the sun began to rise over the ruins of the cities, the Veldan leaders met once again to discuss their next steps. They had won the battle, but the war with the Deathworlders had only just begun. The alliance with these fierce warriors was their only hope for survival, but what would the cost of that survival be? The future of Veldan was uncertain, and the Veldan Council's decision would have lasting consequences. Would the Deathworlders truly be their saviors, or would they one day come to regret this desperate alliance? The silence in the war room was deafening, and the question that hung in the air was clear. What would happen after the battle was won? You said, the price of salvation. The battle for Gul'dan was over, but the war with the Deathworlders had only just begun. As the dust settled and the last of the invaders were driven from the planet, the citizens of Veldan slowly began to process what had happened. Their world had been saved, but the cost of that salvation was still a mystery. The Deathworlders had proven their strength beyond measure, but their motives remained unclear. The Veldan leaders had trusted them, and for now, their planet was safe. But as the hours passed, the question on everyone's mind was the same. What would the Deathworlders want in return? In the heart of Veldan's capital, the Council gathered once again in their war room. The screens flickered to life, and the cold, expressionless face of the Deathworlder fleet captain appeared. His presence was commanding, and his silence only added to the tension in the room. "We've done what you asked," Elira, the Veldan Council leader, said, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "Our planet is safe, but we need to know, what is it that you want from us?" The captain's gaze was unwavering, and for a moment he simply stared at them. The silence stretched on, thick with anticipation. Then, finally, he spoke. "Nothing, for now," he said flatly. "But you will know when the time comes." Elira felt a chill run through her as the words echoed in her mind. For now. What did that mean? Did the Deathworlders have a long-term plan for Veldan, or was their involvement only temporary? Every leader in the room knew that the price of their survival was not going to be an easy one. "I don't trust them," one of the council members, a man named Derek, muttered under his breath. His voice trembled with fear. "They saved us, but at what cost? What do they want from us once we're indebted?" Elira turned to Derek, her face resolute. "We don't know yet. We'll just have to wait. For now, we focus on rebuilding and keeping the peace." But even as she spoke, Elira couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her gut. The Deathworlders weren't just here to help. They were here for something. She could feel it in the air, a silent promise of something yet to come. Elsewhere on Veldan, the streets were slowly coming back to life. People walked through the once ruined cities, now littered with the remains of the enemy forces, but also full of hope. They had been saved. But the feeling of triumph was overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of unease. The Deathworlders had made it clear that their help came with no guarantees. The Deathworlders were not known for mercy. They had destroyed the invaders with ruthless precision, leaving nothing in their wake. But now that the fighting had stopped, what would happen next? Would they demand tribute, resources, or perhaps something more sinister? The Veldans didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at them. A small group of Veldan soldiers approached one of the Deathworlder commanders. His massive frame towered over them, his dark eyes hidden behind a visor that reflected the light from the distant sun. The soldiers stood nervously, unsure of how to approach. They had been saved by these warriors, but now they feared the consequences. The commander's voice was low, almost robotic. "Do not worry. For now, you are safe." He paused, his cold gaze sweeping over the group. "But remember this. Nothing comes without a cost. We have no interest in your planet's wealth, but you will have to pay for your survival." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. What did that mean? The commander didn't elaborate. Instead, he simply turned and walked away, leaving them with more questions than answers. Back in the war room, the council members sat in tense silence. They knew that the Deathworlders had to be watched closely. Elira's mind raced as she thought about what had just happened. Could they ever fully trust the Deathworlders? What would they ask for once the Veldans had finished rebuilding? No one knew, and the mystery was growing by the hour. Then the Deathworlder fleet captain's voice came over the comms once again. "Your planet is safe for now," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "But when the time comes, you will know what we want. It will not be easy. Do not forget this." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the council to ponder the captain's words. Elira took a deep breath and turned to the others. "We'll keep the peace for as long as we can," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll rebuild and prepare for whatever they want. But we will be ready." The Veldans had made a choice, and now they had to live with the consequences. They were alive, for the time being. But as the days passed, they couldn't shake the feeling that the Deathworlders were waiting for something. Their true intentions were still unknown, and that uncertainty would hang over them like a dark cloud. Would they remain allies, or would they turn into something far more dangerous? Time would tell, but for now, the Veldans could only wait and wonder. The shadow of debt. Weeks had passed since the Deathworlders' arrival, and the atmosphere on Veldan had shifted. The initial relief of survival had given way to an uneasy tension. The people of Veldan were grateful for the Deathworlders' intervention, but the promise of nothing for now hung heavily over their heads. They had been saved, but at what cost? And what would be demanded of them when the time came? Elira, the leader of the Veldan Council, spent her days in constant meetings, her mind constantly focused on the Deathworlders. There was no denying that the fleet had been instrumental in repelling the invaders, but now the real question was, what did they truly want? The enigmatic captain's words echoed in her thoughts, each repetition twisting her stomach further. Nothing for now. The phrase had taken on a sinister tone. No one knew what nothing meant. Was it a trick, a temporary reprieve before they demanded something even more costly? Elira had heard the whispers among the citizens, rumors of what the Deathworlders might ask for. Some believed they would want to take control of the planet's resources, while others feared the worst. Would they come to claim the planet as their own? Or would they demand something far more personal, something that could break the very spirit of the Veldan people? The council was at a standstill, unable to take any real action. They had no choice but to wait and prepare for the unknown. Meanwhile, on the streets of Veldan, the people carried on with their daily lives, but their eyes were always scanning the sky. Every time they heard the low hum of Deathworlder ships overhead, their hearts skipped a beat. It was a sound that signaled their salvation, but also the uncertainty of what was to come. The once bustling marketplaces had become quieter, The shops no longer filled with the same vibrancy as before. People spoke in hushed tones, constantly looking over their shoulders, wondering if their allies might one day become their oppressors. The shadow of the Deathworlders loomed over them all, casting a chill over what had once been a peaceful world. Back in the heart of the capital, Elira and the council members gathered once again. The mood was tense, and no one spoke for several minutes. Then, the familiar flicker of the communication screen signaled the arrival of the Deathworlder fleet captain. He appeared, towering and imposing, his armored figure making the room feel smaller. His voice was as cold and emotionless as ever. "We have honored our part," the captain said, his words cutting through the silence. "Now it is time for you to honor yours." Elira's heart raced, and the council members shifted nervously in their seats. This was the moment they had all been dreading. The captain's words were simple, but they carried an unmistakable weight. The cost had come. They had feared this moment, and now it was here. "What do you want from us?" Elira asked, her voice steady, but betraying a flicker of uncertainty. The captain didn't respond immediately. His cold eyes studied her, as though weighing her every word, before he spoke again. "Resources," he said simply. "Not wealth, but something more valuable to you. We have seen your potential, Velden. You are not weak, but you will need to prove it." The room fell into a stunned silence. Resources? That could mean anything. The Velden people had limited resources, and whatever they had left had already been stretched thin by the invasion and subsequent rebuilding efforts. But what could be more valuable than wealth? Elira's mind raced, trying to understand the implications of the Deathworlder's words. "What do you mean?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice calm. "What exactly do you want?" The captain's gaze never wavered. "You will understand soon enough. For now, your task is simple. Prepare yourselves. Build. Grow stronger. You will need to be ready for what is to come." Elira's mind whirled. The Deathworlders weren't just asking for resources. They were demanding something more, something that would take the Velden's very future to repay. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that their planet's fate now rested in their hands. They had no choice but to comply. The Deathworlders had saved them, but now their salvation came at a price. As the transmission ended and the captain's image disappeared from the screen, the room filled with a heavy silence. Elira turned to the others, her mind still reeling from the captain's cryptic words. "What do they want?" Derek, one of the council members, asked in a hoarse whisper. "What does it mean to prove our potential?" Elira didn't have the answers. She couldn't. All she knew was that the Deathworlders' request was not a simple one. It was a demand for something that would stretch the very limits of their planet's resources. But they had no choice. The fate of Velden was now tied to the Deathworlders, and whatever it was they wanted, the Veldens would have to find a way to give it to them. Outside, the city of Velden was a far cry from the chaos of the past weeks. The streets were quieter now. The sound of the Deathworlder ships overhead a constant reminder of the price they had paid. People moved about with weary determination, but the uncertainty of the future hung in the air like a storm cloud. In the distance, the Deathworlder ships hovered above the planet, their ominous presence a constant reminder that their help had come at a cost. And as the Veldens prepared for whatever was to come next, they couldn't shake the feeling that their planet was no longer entirely their own. It had been saved, but at what price? Only time would reveal the true cost of the Deathworlder's salvation, and the Veldens could only hope that they were ready for the price that would come due. "You said," the unexpected demands. The city of Velden had begun to adapt to the new reality. The once ruined buildings were now being rebuilt, and the streets were once again filled with life, though the shadows of the past invasion still loomed. Yet the overwhelming feeling of uncertainty never left. The citizens had been saved, but the price of that salvation was still unclear. The Deathworlders had spoken in vague terms, and each day that passed added to the growing tension on the planet. Elira had tried to prepare her people, but nothing had quite prepared her for what the Deathworlders would demand. The Council had been informed that they would need to prove their potential, but no one knew what that truly meant. As the days wore on, the cryptic messages continued to arrive from the Deathworlder fleet, each more ominous than the last. Their presence remained constant, hovering above the planet like an ever-watchful eye. "Prepare yourselves. Build. Grow stronger," the fleet captain's message had repeated in various forms, leaving the Council in a state of confusion and fear. It was clear that the Deathworlders were not content with simple resources or wealth. They wanted something deeper, something that would test the very heart of Velden. The question was, what? Elira had spent countless hours in the war room with the other Council members, trying to piece together the puzzle. The Deathworlders had no need for wealth or land. They were a species that had conquered entire star systems, their fleet vast and terrifying. No, what they wanted was something more intangible, something that would change the very fabric of Velden itself. One evening, a breakthrough came in the form of an unexpected message. It wasn't from the fleet captain, but from a new, unknown source. The message was short, but the words it contained sent a chill down Elira's spine. Humanity's strength lies in its survival. You must prove you can survive the trials ahead. Only then will you be free of your debt. The message ended abruptly, and for a moment, Elira stared at the screen in disbelief. Trials. What did the Deathworlders mean by that? Was it a test of strength, of survival, or something more sinister? What does it mean? Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper as the Council members gathered around the screen. What do they expect us to do? Elira's mind raced, but there was only one thing she was sure of. The Deathworlders were watching them, waiting for something. The trials were inevitable, and whatever came next, the Veldens would have to face it head-on. The next few days were marked by a sudden surge of activity. Construction efforts had doubled, with new technologies brought by the Deathworlders to speed up the process. Factories were built to mass-produce weapons, resources were being hoarded, and the once peaceful citizens of Velden were now training as soldiers, preparing for something none of them truly understood. But even as the people worked, there was a growing fear in the air. Whispers spread through the streets about the true nature of the trials. Some said it would be a battle against other planets, a test of strength and power. Others feared the trials would be more personal, testing their loyalty and resolve. And then, one day, the trial began. The ground shook as an enormous ship descended from the sky, its massive frame blocking out the sun. The Deathworlder fleet had arrived in full force, and this time, it wasn't for a battle. It was for something far more terrifying. The fleet captain's voice echoed across the planet's communication network, his words calm and deliberate. The trials have begun. Prepare yourselves. Only those who survive will be worthy of freedom. The transmission ended, leaving Velden in stunned silence. The people had been preparing for something, but nothing could have prepared them for this. What did survival mean in the eyes of the Deathworlders? How could they survive a trial that was shrouded in such mystery? As the days passed, strange things began to happen. The Deathworlder ships released drones that scoured the planet, scanning every corner of Velden. But it wasn't just a search for resources or weaknesses. It was something else. The drones observed the citizens, watched their reactions, and monitored their every move. Elira felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The people of Velden had no choice but to comply with the Deathworlders' demands. But how could they survive a trial that was so vague, so dangerous? Was it even possible to emerge victorious? In the midst of all the uncertainty, there was one thing that Elira was certain of. The Deathworlders weren't just testing their strength. They were testing their spirit. They wanted to see how far the Veldens would go to survive, what sacrifices they were willing to make, and what price they were prepared to pay. Days turned into weeks, and still the trials continued. The people of Velden grew weary. Their nerves stretched thin. But they held firm, knowing that their survival depended on their ability to withstand whatever the Deathworlders had planned. The trials were far from over, and the true cost of survival was still unknown. But as Ilara stood on the balcony overlooking the bustling city, watching the citizens continue to work, she made a silent vow to herself and to her people. No matter what the Deathworlders demanded, they would not break. They had survived the invasion, and they would survive whatever came next. The trials had begun, but Velden was not going to fall. Not now. Not ever. The breaking point. The trials had stretched on for weeks, and the tension on Velden had reached its peak. The once vibrant streets had grown quieter, the people's faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. The Deathworlders' demands had taken a toll on their spirit, but they continued to fight, not knowing what the trials would ask of them next. Their resolve had been tested, and many had begun to question how much longer they could endure. The Deathworlders had shown no signs of relenting. Their ships remained in orbit, silently watching, their presence a constant reminder of the price they demanded for salvation. And though they had brought technology and knowledge that helped the Veldens rebuild, the true cost of that help had become more apparent with each passing day. Ilara stood in the war room once again, her hands pressed against the cold metal of the table. She looked at the faces of the council members, all of them weary but determined. The people of Velden had endured so much already, but the trials were far from over. Each day, the challenges grew more difficult, more dangerous. The latest trial had been a test of endurance, a brutal physical challenge designed to push every individual to their limits. Some had not made it. The thought of losing more people haunted Ilira's every waking moment. "We can't keep doing this," Derek muttered, his voice tinged with desperation. "We can't keep pushing our people like this. They're breaking." Ilira knew he was right. The Veldens were strong, but they weren't indestructible. The death toll had been rising, and morale had plummeted. No one knew how much longer they could survive the trials, especially when the costs seemed to increase with each challenge. But Ilira couldn't give in. Not now. Not when the people of Velden had fought so hard to stay alive. She had promised them survival, and she would not fail them. "We must hold on," she said, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. "If we break now, we will lose everything. The Deathworlders are watching us, and they will not show mercy. We must prove that we can endure." The council members nodded, though their faces betrayed the uncertainty they all felt. They had already given so much, and yet it felt like the worst was still to come. That night, Ilira couldn't sleep. She walked through the silent city, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The lights were dim, and there was a sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air. The Veldens had been resilient, but their strength was fading. Ilira knew that if they didn't find a way to change the course of the trials, they would break under the pressure. As she passed through the city's central square, she saw a group of Velden soldiers gathered around a fire. They spoke in low voices, their faces grim. Ilira paused, listening. The words were quiet, but they reached her ears with a chilling clarity. "We can't keep fighting for them. The Deathworlders have done enough. It's time we take control of our own fate." The words echoed in Ilira's mind. The thought of rebellion had taken root. Some of the citizens were starting to question the Deathworlders' motives. They had saved them, yes, but at a cost. Now they were asking for more than just resources. They were demanding the very soul of the Velden people. Would the Veldens continue to fight for survival, or would they choose to fight for freedom? Ilira felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had spent her entire life serving the people of Velden, but now, faced with the possibility of rebellion, she wasn't sure what the right choice was. The Veldens had been pushed to the brink, and the fear of losing everything was becoming too great to ignore. As Ilira walked away from the soldiers, she made a decision. She couldn't let fear guide their actions. If they were to survive, it wouldn't be through rebellion. It would be through strength, unity, and perseverance. The Deathworlders may have demanded their obedience, but they could never take away the Veldens' will to survive. The next day, Elira called for a public address. She stood before her people, her voice amplified through the city's loudspeakers, and for the first time in weeks, the streets were filled with the quiet murmur of the Veldans gathering to hear what their leader had to say. "My people," Elira began, her voice steady despite the tumultuous emotions running through her. "I know that the trials have taken a toll on all of us. I know the cost has been great, but we cannot give in to fear. We cannot let the pressure of these trials break us. The Deathworlders may have given us this chance, but it is up to us to prove that we deserve it." The crowd listened in silence, hanging on her every word. "We will face whatever comes next, together," Elira continued. "We will show the Deathworlders that we are more than just survivors. We are a people who will rise, no matter the odds. And when this is over, when the trials are behind us, we will stand tall, knowing that we fought for our future. Not just for survival, but for freedom." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, Elira saw a flicker of hope in the eyes of her people. They weren't just fighting for their survival anymore. They were fighting for something far greater, their freedom, their future. The trials had brought them to the breaking point, but Elira knew that it was at this moment that their true strength would emerge. The Deathworlders had underestimated the Veldan people. They had tested their endurance, their spirit, but they had never truly understood the heart of the Veldans. And now, the real fight was about to begin. The trials would not break them. They would only make them stronger. The final trial. The days had turned into weeks, and the trials were nearing their climax. The citizens of Veldan had endured every test thrown at them, from physical challenges to mental and emotional endurance. The Deathworlders had kept their word. There had been no mercy, no reprieve. But through it all, the Veldans had held on, proving their strength, their unity, and their resolve. Yet, even now, as the final trial loomed, there was no clear indication of what would come next. The Deathworlders had remained silent, their ships still hovering in the sky, watching and waiting. The drones had ceased their relentless scanning, and the tests had stopped for the time being. The people were restless, and the tension in the air was palpable. Elira stood before the council once again, her brow furrowed in concentration. They had done everything the Deathworlders had asked of them, and yet the final trial remained a mystery. What would it be? And how could they prepare for something they didn't understand? "We faced everything they've thrown at us," Derek said, his voice tired but determined. "But this last trial, it's different. They've never given us a clear indication of what it will be. It's like they want us to fail." Elira nodded, understanding his fear. The weight of the unknown was crushing. It felt as though the Deathworlders were simply waiting for the right moment to strike, to see if the Veldans had truly earned their place in the galaxy. But Elira refused to believe that the Veldans had come this far only to be cast aside at the final moment. "We won't fail," Elira said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that gripped her heart. "We've come this far, and we will prove that we are worthy. The Deathworlders may test us in ways we can't predict, but they've underestimated us before, and they will again." The council members exchanged uncertain glances, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. Elira's words had reminded them of the strength they had shown, the unity they had built. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their future. As the council meeting ended, Elira stepped out into the city, her mind heavy with thoughts of the final trial. The people were preparing themselves for whatever came next, their spirits buoyed by the words of their leader. Elira knew that the true test wasn't just about surviving the challenges. It was about maintaining their dignity, their integrity, in the face of unimaginable pressure. The night before the final trial, the streets were quieter than they had been in weeks. The citizens of Veldan had gathered in their homes, resting before the next challenge. The air was thick with tension, but there was also a quiet determination that had settled over the planet. They would face whatever came next, and they would face it together. In the early hours of the morning, the call came. It was a transmission from the Deathworlder fleet, their cold, impassive voice echoing across the planet. "The final trial begins now," the voice intoned. "Prepare yourselves." And then the transmission cut off. There was no explanation, no further instructions. The trial had begun. Immediately, the streets were filled with movement. The Veldans had no idea what awaited them, but they knew that they had to be ready. The people rushed to their stations, to their posts, to the makeshift training grounds that had been set up over the past weeks. The final trial had begun, and there was no turning back. For hours, there was nothing but silence. The Deathworlders had not revealed what the trial would be, but Elara knew that it was something that would test them all in ways they had never imagined. The Veldans had already shown their strength, their resilience, their ability to survive. But what did the Deathworlders want now? What kind of trial could push them to the brink? Suddenly, the ground shook. At first, it was a tremor, barely noticeable. But it quickly intensified, growing stronger with each passing second. The Veldans looked up to the sky, where the massive fleet of Deathworlder ships loomed overhead, their engines igniting as they began to descend toward the planet. But they weren't landing. Instead, the ships hovered just above the ground. And then, without warning, massive beams of energy shot out, striking the surface of the planet. The Veldans scrambled, running to take cover as the beams carved through the landscape, tearing through buildings and infrastructure with terrifying precision. The sky darkened as the ships continued to unleash their devastating firepower, leaving destruction in their wake. Elara stood in the midst of the chaos, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the final trial, the test of survival. The Deathworlders had not given them a challenge of strength, but a challenge of endurance. They were testing the very fabric of their society, seeing how the Veldans would react when pushed to the brink of annihilation. The question was no longer whether they could survive the trials. They had already done that. The true question was whether they could rise from the ashes of their broken world and rebuild stronger than before. As the destruction rained down around her, Elira's mind raced. The Veldans had faced death before. They had survived the invasion, the tests, the horrors of the past, and they would survive this too. The final trial was not about winning. It was about proving that the Veldans could stand tall in the face of destruction. It was about showing the Deathworlders that they were not just survivors. They were a people who would rebuild, no matter the cost. As the skies above Velden rained destruction upon them, Elara stood firm, her resolve unwavering. The trials had tested them in ways they had never imagined, but one thing was certain. The Veldans would never give up, and the Deathworlders would never break them. Not now. Not ever. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check him.